So, before we get into chapter 6, your last opportunity to ask questions about homework number 1. So, remember, homework number 1's due first thing in the morning at 9 a.m. I would prefer you to turn in like a physical copy of it, but if that's not possible, we'll make things do. But yeah, and it doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be typed up as long as it's legible and in some sort of working order by which I can review it. That's the most important thing, okay? So, any questions? We feel pretty good about the first homework? Okay, so let's without too much further ado, let's talk about chapter 6 here. Okay. So chapter 6 is about risk and the term structure of interest rates. Risk and the term structure of interest rates. Okay, so this morning, if you think about what we did, we really spent the morning talking about why interest rates in general go up, right? So we talked about why interest rates go up, we talked about interest rates go down, but you notice that we didn't really talk about why different bonds have different interest rates, okay? So we talked as if there's one interest rate in the economy, but we know that there's many different types of interest rates in the economy, right? And particularly different bonds have different interest rates. And so that's really the focus of chapter 6. Why is it that different bonds have different interest rates? Just to kind of see this in practice, if you look here at the long-term bond yields, right? So these are looking at yields on long-term bonds, right? Bonds that have a life of more than 1 year. So we see a couple of things here. The green is municipal bonds, right? State and local government bonds. The blue is corporate bonds. The black is long-term government bonds. And the red is corporate AA bonds, right? We'll talk here in a minute about what the difference between corporate AA and corporate BAA bonds are. So there's a couple of things to note. First off, all interest rates tend to move together, right? So in other words, when US government bonds go up, corporate bonds go up, municipal bonds go up. When they go down, they tend to go down. That's the point of this morning, right? Is that all interest rates tend to move up, they tend to move down together. But that said, different bonds do have different levels of the interest rate, right? One of the things that we see here is that state and municipal bonds tend to have the lowest yields. Then after that, government bonds, treasury bonds, and then after that, corporate AA bonds, and then those that have the highest yields are corporate BAA bonds. It's hard to see though, but there has been a change though in that ranking. And one of the things that we've seen recently is that treasury bills have actually been having lower yields than municipal bonds. And so we'll talk about why that is. There's a reason why that ranking has changed. But traditionally, municipal bonds have the lowest yields, right? Even lower than T-bills or treasury bonds. That has changed here in the last few years for reasons we'll talk about. So anyway, all interest rates tend to move together, but different types of bonds have different interest rates. That's what we want to try to understand this afternoon. And really, what we're going to see is that when it comes to why different bonds pay different interest rates, there's really 4 reasons. 3 of them, very straightforward. The 4th, more complex, right? So, Okay, 4 reasons why different bonds have different interest rates. The first is pretty obvious, default risk. Default risk. So different bonds have different default risk. As we talked about, US Treasury bills and Treasury bonds are usually thought to be default risk-free. Why? Because, well, at some level, it seems very unlikely that the government would default, right? Given, the fact that the government can always raise money through taxes. So that seems unlikely that they would do that. But at an even deeper level, government bonds just say they have to be repaid in dollars, right? And so if the government needed to, they could just turn on the printing press and print up a whole bunch of dollars and pay back all those bonds. So, well, this is technically not true. The government could default, right? You could see a situation, for instance, that is always threatened, where Congress and the president just couldn't agree on a budget, and as a result, the Treasury couldn't make some payments. That could happen. I mean, certainly it's not politics risk-free. Nothing is nowadays, right? But as a practical matter, it seems as unlikely as almost anything that the government would not be able to pay its bills, right? What about corporate bonds versus municipal bonds? Which one is riskier? No clear answer, right? No clear answer. Can state and local government default on their bonds? Sure. And if you don't think so, go talk to people in Detroit, right? Where it's, local government defaulted on their bonds. Orange County, California defaulted on their bonds, right? This happens, right? This happens. Not a lot, but it happens, right? Puerto Rico defaulted on some bonds that they had. So yeah, this happens. So there is really no clear ranking between corporate and municipal bonds. It really depends upon the details of who exactly is borrowing the money. One of the things that's often discussed in financial markets is what's called the risk premium. What is the risk premium? It's a spread between the interest rate on a specific bond and the risk-free Treasury bond interest rate. So the risk premium is a measure of default risk. Right? It's a measure of default risk. It's one way that you can kind of rule of thumb how risky is this bond and what compensation does the market demand for the risk of this bond, right? So if I told you that there was a corporate bond, let's say IBM bond, 20-year bond, was paying 6%. And then I told you the T-bond for its similar 20-year bond was 4%, then what's the risk premium? 2%. That's essentially what the market is demanding for compensation for the increased risk. And if you think about how this happens and why this changes, well, it changes because markets have different perceptions at different times about what the risk is of this bond and how much return they should get for that risk, right? So let's think about an example here. Let's just say there's an increase in macroeconomic default risk, right? The economy is performing poorly. You could think about this today, right? COVID, right? So the economy is performing poorly. How is that likely to increase the risk or change the risk premium? So let's think about two different bond markets. Let's think about the corporate bond market. And then let's think about the treasury bond market. Okay. Now, this is going to take some fancy drawing by me, which is always potentially risky, right? Yeah, you want to talk about risk. What should we try to do art? Okay, so we have two markets here, the treasury bond market, the corporate bond market. Notice here, what's true about the yield to maturity on corporate bonds? It's higher than the yield to maturity on treasury bonds. And what's the difference here? We took this difference over. The difference between this is a risk premium. The risk premium, the difference between the yield on treasury bonds and the yield on corporate bonds. Now, what happens if something like COVID strikes and markets are worried that there's going to be more defaults, including some big companies? What's going to happen here? Demand's going to fall, right? And in periods of high risk, where does that money tend to flow into? Treasury bonds, right? There's a flight to safety, right? There's a flight to safety. And so money gets pulled out of the corporate bond market and money goes into the treasury bond market. And so now, what's the new treasury bond interest rate? Lower. What's the new corporate bond interest rate? Higher. And notice that the risk premium's gone up. Okay. This is often referred to as the flight to safety. And it happens all the time when markets get spooked. Markets get spooked. What do some people do? They pull it out of the corporate bond market. They pull it out of the municipal bond market. They're thinking, where can I put my money that's safe? Treasury bonds, treasury bills, right? That tends to be the place where people park their money when they're worried. And so you tend to see these risk premiums fluctuate over time, right? You tend to see these risk premiums fluctuate over time. What happens to risk premiums during bad times? They get bigger. What happens to risk premiums during good times? They tend to get smaller, right? So, once again, these risk premiums are really pro-cyclical, right? They go down when the economy goes, they're counter-cyclical. They go up when the economy goes down, and they go down when the economy goes up, right? Now, I just talked about corporate bonds here in general, but are all corporate bonds the same default risk? No, obviously not, right? How exactly is default risk determined? Well, listen, every individual investor has got to make that decision for themselves. You've got to think about what you think the default risk is for different sorts of bonds. Now, there are ratings agencies, okay? You would think that there's really three big ratings agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. You think that they could make it easy by agreeing to one grading system, but of course they can't, right? That would be too simple. So if you really have three different grades, they all kind of look alike. They're just enough to make it really, they're just enough alike to really make it confusing, right? But you have Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch. You know, a lot of people use Standard & Poor's. I would say of the three, that Standard & Poor's is probably the one that, you know, gets the most attention. And so you can see kind of their grading scale, right? AAA, right? Let's just focus on Standard & Poor's. AA plus, AA, AA minus, A plus, A minus, B plus plus, okay? And then all the way down to BBB, etc. How much weight should we put into these things? Can they be wrong? Undoubtedly, they can be wrong. And part of it is because there's this really, I mean, it's not a system that you would design, but there's a huge moral hazard problem with Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. And that moral hazard problem is who pays them to give the ratings? The companies pay them to give a rating, right? And so companies basically shop for rating agencies, right? In other words, they're more likely to go to rating agencies that give them a higher grade. And companies know this. The rating agencies know this. They know that they can't be too tough or else nobody is going to come to them to pay to have their bonds rated. So it's a huge conflict of interest, right? And so there have been some things that took place in the Frank Dodd Financial Reform Act that tried to reform rating agencies. But, you know, I'll still say, in my opinion, I don't trust them, right? I don't trust them. Because I think there's just some really big conflicts of interest here that you just can't ignore, right? You just can't ignore. Probably the biggest distinction here is between, where is it? I get confused here. It's between BBB and above and BBB and below, okay? Why? BBB and above is usually known as investment grade, okay? And what investment grade means is that pension funds and other big institutional investors can hold those bonds. But when you get below that, they're referred to as junk bonds. And junk bonds are not junk, right? But they are higher risk, right? Higher risk bonds. So one of the problems for a firm is if you fall to junk status, there's going to be a lot fewer people to buy your bond because pension companies are huge holders of these bonds, right? So being an investment grade is a really big deal, right? In some sense, like going from AA to AA plus or from A plus to AA minus, that's not a big deal for companies. Yes, it will impact your yield a little bit, but from going from here to there, big, right? Very big. And so, trying to maintain, it's a big deal when a company is able to get to investment grade because there's just a much bigger market. Likewise, it's a big deal if you fall below investment grade because that really means that pension companies that hold your bonds have to sell them. And so that can be pretty dramatic. Just to get some idea of how much these risk premiums can change during the 2008 financial crisis. If you looked at the risk premium on BAA bonds, so these kind of bonds here, right, that are really right below investment grade, right, their risk spread jumped up by about 3%, okay, which is big, right? A 3% increase in the interest rate and the yield is really big, right? Really big. And so, yeah, these things can swing pretty widely. Okay, so that's default risk, right? And this is not the kind of class where we get into talking about how exactly you assess the default risk of a certain bond. And you take asset pricing, for those of you who are finance majors and you take asset pricing, you'll probably talk about that in a lot more detail. We're just kind of, more talking about the big picture. So the first thing that influences, the first reason why different bonds pay different interest rates is default risk, all right? That's the first one. I think that was pretty straightforward. The second one, which we talked about this morning, is liquidity risk. All right, and this is really the transaction costs. We discussed this morning. And partly it's like the time it could take you to sell, how easy is it going to be to find a seller? But then it's also the difference between that bid and ask price, right? How much of a cost, how much of a hit are you going to have to take in terms of paying a fee to buy or sell, right? This differs dramatically from different sorts of bonds. In general, you would think that the most liquid are T-bonds, and particularly T-bills, right? So T-bills are extremely liquid. T-bonds are more liquid. Investment-grade corporate bonds junk bonds, and municipal bonds. As a general rule, though I don't, once again, for any individual bond, there are probably some bonds out there, some municipal bonds, that are more liquid than some junk bonds, right? So I don't want to say this is true for every bond, but just as a kind of general rule, if you buy a municipal bond, you have to spend more time worrying about liquidity risk, undoubtedly, right? And you are probably going to take a bigger hit if you have to sell. And so one way that you can think about this, and I think this is one of the way investors think about it, is if you're down here in this end of the bond market, you probably want to be following a buy and hold strategy, right? This is, if you're buying these things, you're probably not going to want to turn around and sell them. As opposed to up here, in T-bills, you can do a lot of short-term parking. So you have $1 million and you have something, a trade you're going to conduct tomorrow. Well, when you have $1 million, you don't want to just wait 24 hours and not get anything for it. So these markets are liquid enough that you can just buy treasury bills today and turn around and sell them tomorrow, right? That might make sense for you financially. And so the liquidity up here allows you to do a lot of short-term parking, right? Just kind of put your money in there for a little bit of time and then pull it out when you need it back. What do people get down here in municipal bonds? What's the big advantage of municipal bonds?
Tax benefits.
Tax benefits. And that, of course, is the other thing. That's the other thing that you got to think about. Different kinds of bonds will have different income considerations, particularly municipal bonds. Municipal bonds are not completely tax exempt. They're just federal tax exempt, right? Federal tax exempt. So one of the things that we've seen here is that the Trump administration, for instance, cut the federal tax on capital gains taxes. What impact did that have on municipal bonds?
Decrease in it?
It decreased, it made them less attractive, right? So whenever you get tax cuts make municipal bonds less attractive. Right? Tax increases make municipal bonds more attractive. To what kind of investor are municipal bonds going to be the most attractive?
High tax bracket.
High tax bracket. And so these are essentially a tax shelter. So, you know, Warren Buffett a year or two ago said that he looked at his taxes and he compared it to his secretary, and his marginal tax rate was about 13% and his secretary's was about 28%. How in the world is Warren Buffett paying 13% taxes? I don't know exactly. I didn't see his tax return, but there's a pretty good bet that a lot of it is shielded in these municipal bonds, right? I mean, these are a classic tax shelter for people that have higher incomes. So, right, you know, if you have the kind of money that you can buy and hold these things, yeah, they're very attractive. And the richer you are, the higher tax bracket you're on, you are, the more attractive these things become. Okay, so those are three of the four things, right? Bonds differ in interest rate because of default risk. They differ because of liquidity risk. They differ because of tax considerations. Now we're to the last one, but as I said, the last one is more complex. The last one is maturity. And the relationship between maturity and interest rates is not simple. Okay, before we talk about the role that maturity plays in interest rates, I want to introduce you to something called the yield curve. Okay, what is the yield curve? Okay, the yield curve is just simply a plot of how the yield changes on similar bonds as maturity changes. Right? What happens to the yield on similar bonds as the maturity changes? So the yield curve is really a plot that looks at maturity and yield to maturity. What could yield curves look like? Well, do they look like this? Do they look like this? Do they look like this? Do they look like that? Well, yield curves have different looks, right? Honestly, yield curves can look different at different points in time. You need to understand why that is. But before we kind of talk about the details, we will say, even though yield curves are really kind of all over the place, there are some basic facts that we observe about them. There are three facts about them that we should be familiar with. First, interest rates on all sorts of bonds move together. And we talked about that first graph that I showed you, right? Regardless of maturity, we tend to see interest rates go up together and they go down together. So here are some different lines. These are looking at bonds that have 20 years to maturity, 3 months to maturity, 3 to 10 years to maturity, okay? What do we typically see? Regardless of the maturity, they tend to move together, right? So when 20-year maturity bonds go up, 3-month bonds tend to see their yields go up as well, all right? So regardless of the maturity, interest rates tend to move together. That's a fact about yield curve. So in other words, if we put that into practice, or think about that in terms of a yield curve, it tends to mean that yield curves shift up or they shift down. Right? The yield curves, regardless of what it looks like, tend to shift up or they tend to shift down. Typically, yield curves slope upwards. In other words, typically yield curves look something like this. However, yield curves can become inverted. And by inverted, we mean flat or downward sloping. They can become flat or even downward sloping. And so we need to understand, why is this, right? Why exactly do yield curves become inverted, and what can that tell us? And why are they upward sloping in general, right? Why in general are they upward sloping, but why do sometimes they become inverted or downward sloping, okay? So the model we're going to use to explain this works pretty well. It's what's called the liquidity premium hypothesis. Okay? Now, the liquidity premium hypothesis sounds really confusing. It's hard to put into words, but I hope after we talk about it a little bit, you'll kind of see it's a pretty simple idea, okay? Here's the idea. I'm just going to write it all up and then I'll try to explain it. Okay, that's a mouthful. The yield to maturity on a long-term bond is the average of the yield to maturities on a series of short-term bonds. Okay? The yield to maturity on a long-term bond is the average of the yield to maturities on a series of short-term bonds, plus a risk premium to compensate for the additional risk, the additional interest rate risk in a long-term bond. Okay, maybe this is a little bit easier to see mathematically. So, what's the interest rate on an N period bond at time T? Time T would be today, right? And N is the number of periods. In other words, the maturity, number of periods. What would it be? Well, it would be the interest rate on a one-year bond a year from now, and then another one-year bond 2 years from now, plus another one-year bond 3 years from now, all the way out to a one-year bond N years from now, T plus N years from now. So an N-year bond would just be, add up all the yield to maturities on a series of one-year bonds and divide by N to get the average, okay? So this is the average yield to maturity on a series of short-term bonds. Does that make sense? So in other words, what should be the yield to maturity on a 3-year bond? It should just be the average of a one-year bond, and then another one-year bond 2 years from now, and then another one-year bond 3 years from now, okay? You just take the average. But there's one other thing we have to consider. If you were an investor, which one of these would you pick? Would you pick a 3-year bond, or would you pick 3 one-year bonds? Which one is safer? 3 one-year bonds is safer than a 1 3-year bond because of interest rate risk. If interest rates change, you could end up taking a big loss over here. Remember, we talked about this yesterday. The longer the maturity, the more interest rate risk there is. So nobody in their right mind is going to buy a 3-year bond if you can just get 3 one-year bonds. So what do we have to do? We have to compensate them with a risk premium. Right? We have to compensate them with a risk premium. How big is that risk premium? Well, it depends upon how long the bond is. You would expect a 20-year bond to have a bigger risk premium than a 10-year bond, and a 10-year bond a bigger risk premium than a 3-year bond. That makes sense? So it's really a pretty simple idea, right? It really is a pretty simple idea. And as we're going to see here in a second, it actually explains those 3 facts pretty well. So just to see how this works, let's just do a very, very simple example. Let's say that we have a 2-year bond. A 2-year bond is, we're trying to figure out what the yield should be on a 2-year bond, right? We know that a 1-year bond a year from now is 5%. a 1-year bond 2 years from now is 6%. And your risk premium for holding a 2-year bond is 1%. So then what should be the yield that you demand to hold that 2-year bond? What do you need what do you demand? How do we calculate this? You just take the average yields to maturity on a series of 1-year bonds, right? And then we add a risk premium. $6.5%. That's how much you should be compensated for to hold a 2-year bond as opposed to a 1-year bond. And one thing I should make clear here, I didn't really do this, but hopefully it's obvious. I should put expected here, right? Because we don't know for sure what a 1-year bond is going to pay 10 years from now. We don't know. This is an expectation. So there's uncertainty associated with this, right? I might guess completely wrong. I might guess completely wrong and do better or worse than I thought. Okay, does this help us explain those 3 facts? Yes, I think this theory is consistent with those 3 facts. First off, does this explain why bonds of all maturities tend to move together? Yeah, right? A long-term bond is going to have short-term interest rates as part of it, right? So they're related to each other. So yes, if a short-term interest rates go up, that should also push up long-term interest rates and vice versa, right? So yes, this definitely helps us understand the first. What about the second point? That yield curves generally slope up. Why is that? Why do yield curves generally slope up? What in here generally makes it true that you're going to pay more on a long-term bond than a short-term bond?
Because there's more risk the longer the bond lasts.
So there's the risk premium. You have to pay a premium on long-term bonds, right? So the reason why this is going to be upward sloping is because of this premium. Now, the third point is a little bit harder. But I think it helps us get at why this is important. When would yield curves slope downwards? In other words, when might a 20-year bond pay a lower yield to maturity than a 2-year bond? When might that be true?
And like the cost of the 2-year bond is like the future value of the 2 years. So it's like 20 years earlier, the happiness might be right, but like because of the inflation, which drives down the interest rate.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be because of inflation, but I think there's like a more general. Let's look at this example. 1-year bond is 5%, 1-year bond is 6%. So how much does a 2-year bond pay? 6.5%. What happens if we had a situation where where people thought interest rates were going to fall a lot in the future. What would happen to this? A 2-year bond could pay less than a 1-year bond. That's an inverted yield curve, right? That's only going to happen, though, if the market expects interest rates to fall in the future. That's when you get an inverted yield curve. So then let's dig deeper. When might the market expect interest rates to fall in the future? There's a couple of examples. One of them is Guo Minghao just mentioned, right? They think inflation is expected to fall. Right? That could be one reason why you have an inverted yield curve, is markets expect inflation to fall. Likewise, what if markets think inflation is going to go up? The yield curve is going to get steep, right? It's going to get even steeper. When else might markets think that inflation or that interest rates are going to fall? We talked this morning. What? Well, yeah, right. Prices always have to go in inverted, and they have to be opposite. But I'm thinking more big picture. What could be driving a rise in prices and a fall in yields? Could be monetary policy. So I think mainly that's going to be kind of related to this one, right? Because monetary policy is the big determinant of inflation. I think, you know, these two are kind of related to each other. Recessions and expansions. What tends to happen when an economy goes into a recession? Interest rates fall, right? If the market thinks a recession is coming, they think interest rates are going to fall. And that can also signal an inverted yield curve. Okay, so I want to show you some examples of yield curves. And you can see in practice. Okay, so here's just some random yield curves. First off, the first fact. Notice how yields tend to move together, right? This curve tends to shift up and down depending upon whether interest rates are high or interest rates are low, right? So when interest rates are high short term, they also tend to be high long term. When they're low short term, they tend to be long short term, right? So here's that first fact. Second fact, this is not a random selection of yield curves, but typically yield curves slope up. These are a fairly flat group of yield curves. But, you know, this one right here from 1985, that's a pretty typical yield curve, right? It's kind of upward sloping, and it tends to get flatter once you get out to like 15, 20, 30 years, right? Where it doesn't slope up a lot. But you notice here that there are definitely some times when you get flat or inverted yield curves. And when is that likely to be? When the market is expecting not too good things to happen, right? So look at here, 1981, classic example of an inverted yield curve, right? What was happening in January of 1981? Well, that was a severe recession. That was right before a severe recession took place in the US. So the markets were expecting it. Likewise, look at this from February of 2008, right? Remember, the recession had just begun. The 2008 global financial crisis had just begun. And you can see the yield curve getting really flat, right? Getting really flat. So markets were expecting a recession, right? This is one of the reasons why people pay attention to the yield curve, is because the yield curve is an indicator, one indicator of a recession. It's an indicator of what the market thinks is happening to the economy. And so when you see yield curves get really flat or inverted, that often sets off warning bells. So here's kind of a little oddity. Nobody says that they saw COVID coming, right? Except, strangely enough, financial markets did have inverted yield curves last year. Even before we had COVID, yield curves went inverted in the United States, as if the market was expecting something bad to happen. Now, they may not have been expecting COVID bad, but the market was not expecting any great things for 2020. Let's look at an example of this, if I can find this. All right, you can see what I was watching before. All right, so here's an example of yield curve. Let me go up here to 2019, okay? So here's late 2018, and here's really our yield curve, okay? You can see it's looking kind of upward sloping, a little flat out here, but fairly upward sloping. Now I'm just gonna animate this and watch what happens to it as we get into 2019. Right here, we're October 2018. Now we're into 2019. Look at it's getting really flat. And in fact, at different points in time, it gets actually inverted in here, right? So markets were worried about the state of the economy even before COVID took place, right? I think markets in many ways were expecting a recession this year. They didn't think it'd be this bad, but they were expecting a recession. If you kind of play this forward here, you can see how inverted this was getting by the middle of the year, right? I mean, that's kind of a classic inverted yield curve. Right, it gets really inverted. Now we're into October of 2019, and now, now it's looking a little bit more standard. So a lot of people said, oh, maybe the market's missed it. If we just play this out, we got to play this out to March. Oops, somehow I skipped forward too much. Right, so here we are in January. And then you can see here, as we get to February, where all the bad news about COVID is coming out, it starts to go back to inverted again, right? And then it gets really inverted. And then you also see this whole thing shift down as now the market thinks we are in a recession. Interest rates are falling. This whole thing's going down to zero. And short-term interest rates essentially go almost to zero. And so where are we today? Well, if we play this out here to June, right here, September, well, shoot, went too far. We see where this is today. This is where the yield curve is today. So there's a couple of things about our yield curve. First off, it's shifted way down to reflect the fact that interest rates are just low, right? I mean, we are generally in a period of lowest interest rates in the last 30 to 40 years, okay? So way shifted down. All interest rates are very low. Short-term interest rates are almost zero. But the market is somewhat optimistic, right? Strangely enough. The market actually seems to be thinking that we're towards the end of this. Let's hope they're right, right? Let's hope they're right. But the fact that this is fairly strongly upward sloping suggests that the market at least thinks that we might be poised for a stronger recovery. Of course, markets were wrong before, right? But, this is valuable information, right? This is valuable information. If you're in financial markets and you want to know what the market is thinking, or if you want to have some idea about what might be happening in the future, this is a valuable piece of information. And so, yield curves are something that market watchers pay a lot of attention to, right? And so it's really important to understand that this relationship between maturity and interest rates, yes, in general, longer maturities pay higher interest rates, but that's not universally true, right? We can have these periods of time when either because of maybe the market thinks that inflation is going to fall, or because they think the economy is going to tank, that you can get these weird yield curves, and those tell you something. They don't tell you everything though, right? I mean, sometimes I think looking at yield curves is like reading tea leaves, right? It's more of an art than a science, we'll put it that way, right? So I don't think it's indicative. As we saw last year, you know, we had an inverted yield curve and we didn't have an immediate recession. So sometimes markets can be wrong, but sometimes markets are right too, right? Or at least the yield curve. You know, why this is valuable is because people are betting money on this, right? This is not just an opinion. This is an informed opinion that people are risking their livelihoods on. And so there's valuable information in it. There's valuable information. Okay, so that's really it from chapter 6, right? Almost exactly an hour. I'm good at this. So I will send you an email that has our agenda for tomorrow, but the main thing for tomorrow is we're going to talk about the stock market, chapter 8. So that's the big assignment for tomorrow. And then, of course, work on homework number 1 to have that ready to turn in, okay? So good luck with that. Email me if you have any questions. As I said, in a few minutes, I'll send you an email that has all the responsibilities for tomorrow, okay? All right, have a good evening.